Hello, welcome to the Managing Church Property webinar. My name is Steve Ween. I'm the Operations Manager for the Baptist Union, and we'll be going through some general topics about how churches manage property that they are responsible for. So what will we be covering today? Well, first of all, we'll do a general introduction, and then we will then move on to how to look after your buildings and its contents. And then giving some guidance perhaps on how to maintain those buildings and their internal fabric. We will then cover a part about undertaking repairs to the building fabric and how you might think about appointing professional advisors. We'll then just generally touch on getting the most out of your church building, and then go on to cover more specific things such as burial grounds, other building issues, and finishing up with final thoughts and questions. So, introduction. I suppose we ought to start with who is this webinar best for. In general, it's going to be best for people who have responsibility for looking after the church buildings and their fabric. That might be a group of property committees or individuals who have specialist responsibility for that. In a Baptist church, the responsibility really lies with the charity trustees for maintaining their buildings, but they link in with the property trustees. Many churches will have property trustees, either the Baptist Union Corporation or other regional trust companies as their property trustees, or even private trustees. So it's important that overall all of these people have an input into how the buildings are maintained. Another key part of that is the insurance of the building, and of course a lot of Baptist churches will be insured with the Baptist Insurance Company or ecclesiastical group, and they have a very good, helpful website to help churches with those sort of issues. But it's also worth mentioning that churches should, as part of their overall maintenance requirements, consider how the building insurance cover is meeting their needs as well. And then finally, there's an issue about there's the maintenance records, and we'll touch on some of those as well as we go through this presentation, because it's important to keep records so that churches do know where they are with things, and as people move on and new people come on to the property committee, they know whereabouts you are in your programs. So let's move on to the next section, which is looking after your buildings and its contents. I think it can't be overemphasised that maintenance, or regular maintenance, is key to keeping the building in good order. It's much easier to do things on a regular basis than have to fit in urgent repairs at some extra cost. So a good plan to start with is to have an annual maintenance plan, and in that you should include a spring and autumn schedule of works, and we'll cover that in a little bit more detail later. It's also key to go round and look at your church building on a regular basis, so organise regular monthly checks. It's also helpful if you have a team of volunteers and if you have local contractors who you use regularly, because over a period of time they'll establish and understand the building in much more detail and be able to solve things in a much quicker way. One of the key bits to any maintenance programme is to assign a realistic budget, and that, along with other things that we'll talk about later, will help you organise the church's finance to make sure that you keep your building in good order. And one of the important things to do is not to forget that internal fixtures and fittings also need to be understood as well and regularly reviewed. So the maintenance of your building and its contents. First of all, you need to know your building and know your area. That doesn't mean to say that you have to know where you are situated, but what issues might be relevant to your building. So you need to know how the building is constructed, what its materials are made of, but also whether you're in a conservation area, or whether the building is listed, or whether you're locally listed by your local authority, because that will help you understand how you maintain your building. The first starting point is really to have a 5-year inspection survey, and these are carried out to ensure that you've got a full understanding from a professional advisor of the building and what maintenance you might need to do over an initial 1 to 2 year period, over a period of 2 to 5 years, and then further on beyond that period, so that you can then look at building that into your budgets to meet your needs. You also should have a regular logbook, a church maintenance logbook, to record the work you carry out, because as property teams move around and change, it's important that they realise and know where you are with your plans. And if you're using external contractors, it's always good to seek competitive quotes where possible, because it may not be the contractor you're existingly using might be the best option for you.
Steve, we've just had a question on that topic from Jim. It says, have you got suggestions on how to generate your maintenance budget?
Well, clearly the first point is that when you have a 5-year survey, the advisor that creates that will give you a cost base for all of the maintenance issues he identifies. So they should cost those out for you, so you can then add those into your budget for that. There are other things you need to consider in a budget as well, such as what regular maintenance do you already carry out and how much does that cost? Whether you have to pay for contractors to do regular maintenance as well, that should be included in it. So as you build up this information base, then you can create a budget that should fit for each year. They will always vary because of the types of maintenance you might be having to do on your property. But the key starting point, I think, is always going to be this 5-year survey. Okay, so let's move on with undertaking repairs. So as we just outlined, if you have a maintenance plan, the first starting point is to identify from your 5-year survey what needs to go into that. And then when you then have that, you can then, where there's a significant repair required, you can seek the appropriate qualified professional advisor to do more research and give you a better cost base to build that into your plan. The survey that you carry out, the 5-year survey, may well identify other surveys and other specialist reports that you might need to support the evidence of repair for your building. So it's a good start place, if you like, to deal with those sort of issues.
Steve, while you're just talking about professional advisors, we've had a question that says, are there any specialist surveyors that we should use for an inspection survey? I think the question is really, who's the right person to appoint to carry out that work, that survey?
We'll come on to that as part of this when we come to talking about professional advisors, so I can cover that later if that's okay.
Okay.
So the important thing about any repair and maintenance is that it's always good to notify your church insurers that you're planning repairs, especially if they include things like scaffolding and other sort of things that people can access the building in an unusual way, because obviously you want to make sure that your insurance covers your building whilst these repairs are underway. The other thing to do is to check that your building is not a listed building, or check with the Baptist Union Listed Buildings Advisory Committee if it is on the proposed plans that you have at an early stage, so that they can explain or clarify what other authorisations you might need before the work starts. One of the other things that you would need to make sure about is in the budgets is to make sure you've got the appropriate funding available before you commission the works. You wouldn't want to be starting something that you find yourself with more money to spend than you originally budgeted for. And then the other thing that sometimes gets overlooked is a lot of church premises and buildings are quite tight in their sites. So it's always best to check arrangements with your neighbours if necessary, so that you can get access, if you need to external walls from their properties. So we're now moving on to the appointing of professional advisors. And if you have already appointed a surveyor to carry out a 5-year inspections survey, then they're probably the best people to start with to get advice about what you might need to do for other professional advisors. But if you haven't got somebody already appointed, then if you need to look to that or appoint alternative advisors, then it's best to contact several of them and ask them to write in setting out their previous experience on church buildings, their general approach to the church projects that they've dealt with, and more importantly, their proposed fee. At least you then got some idea when you're looking as to whether these people will have the expertise and you will have the necessary money to make the reports sensible to you. And one place you can go to for choosing an architect is to see if they're a member of the Ecclesiastic Architects and Surveyors Association, the EASA, because those people are generally more likely to have dealt with church properties before and will have the expertise and understanding of religious buildings in general.
Steve, do you have a guidance for what this might cost?
The average, well, there isn't an average survey fee because each building is so different, and the more complex the set of buildings are, then the more likely that the costs will be high. The average price is somewhere between £500 and £750, but again, it will depend on the nature of the building, what level of buildings you've got, and also the number of extra reports that might need to be required. But as a baseline figure, you might be thinking somewhere around £700 or just under. So getting the most out of your church building, that's perhaps the bit that some churches really want to focus on. And so the first point is to think about understanding your church building and what it can actually be used for. If your main buildings are used a lot of the time and the areas that you've got available to use are now on the second floor or first floor of a building, then it's important to understand what uses they can be used for. You also need to know what your church's mission is. So you have to have a good plan to decide that the whole church understand what you're trying to do and are prepared to be involved. I think it's important as well that before you start any new projects, having identified what your building can actually accommodate, is to carry out local surveys of your area to find out what gaps in provision there might be that you have the expertise within your congregations to meet. And finally, the most important part, I think, is to get the church members' agreement to any new uses before moving forward. It's much better to have a project that's got the majority of support from within the church and the people that are able to give the expertise that's required to ensure that it's a success. The next issue, I suppose, is about a specific type of church building, and it's more to do with burial grounds. Burial grounds, some churches may or may not have, but if you have one, then the first thing you should be undertaking is a burial ground survey and creating a plan. And it's good to understand what you're actually dealing with, and then from that, including your church maintenance plan and your spring and annual schedule of works, things you might need to do to the burial ground, such as checking the headstones and other memorials to ensure that they are still intact and meet the insurer's topple test requirements. You need to put in place regular maintenance to carry out between March normally and October and probably every 3 or 4 weeks to make sure that it's still accessible if possible. You should be looking at the trees that are on site to make sure that they're safe, they're not likely to fall, and they are under control. They're not overly large for the site, or they've not got any disease that you might be unaware of. And you may need to ask arboreal experts to come and have a look at those sort of issues to give you some guidance on that. And then finally, you need to check your boundary walls, fences and hedges, see if there's any areas of concern or repair there, or where attention is needed. And again, going back to adding those into your spring and autumn schedules of works and into your church maintenance plan. And then we're just going to touch lastly, I suppose, on other building issues. One of the key things that you perhaps need to do...
Steve, just before you move on,
yeah.
we just had a question just come in on burial grounds. So it says, who should undertake these inspections on headstones, etc.? Is that an ordinary surveyor or is a specialist required?
Normally it can be done by a church member, because you can actually see whether or not a headstone or a tomb or any sort of part of the burial ground is looking as though it might fall over or be starting to break up. So the initial topple test view report should be carried out generally by somebody within the church, just to check that, make sure that they're not likely to fall. Once you've found out whether or not they are, then obviously you need to then talk to monumental masons about how you might recite them or reset them, and what other works you might need to do. But the initial test probably can be just dealt with by somebody from within the church. So getting back to other building issues, I think the key thing there is about reviewing your building security regularly, making sure that the locks work, windows mechanisms work well and shut, and that there are sufficient security measures in place for where you are in your locality. The other thing you might need to think about doing is check the precautions you have against metal theft. Metal prices are still high, and it's quite common that thieves will try to attempt to remove metal from isolated or not well visited places. So churches are particularly targeted. So you can use roof alarms and also smart water where necessary to try and protect those sort of things. And guidance can be given by the insurance company on those issues. Church buildings by their nature tend to be good habits for bats and other protected animals, and it's important that if you find out that you've got those sort of things, then you carry out regular surveys to ensure that you know what you're dealing with, because obviously they are protected species, and it's necessary to get relevant licenses if you want to do anything with them. One of the key things to do is, if you've got holes in walls where bats might come through, if you haven't got bats already, then there's a good chance to try and block those up if that's possible. And other protected animals can actually be found in burial grounds and also in church sites anyway. And you need to consider other regulations that affect buildings, church buildings, such as asbestos surveys, and these should be carried out by an appropriately qualified surveyor. Electrical inspection tests and testing. Electrical inspection should be carried out every 5 years and would normally be carried out by a properly qualified electrician, and testing certainly of portable electrical equipment should be done every year to make sure that they are still fit for purpose. You also have to cover things to do with fire precautions. It's good to have a fire precautions survey carried out to make sure that you've got access routes in the right way and well labelled, and also that you've got an evacuation plan in place if you need to have one. There's also health and safety and risk assessments you need to carry out at the building to make sure there are no trip hazards, that there are that people can use the building and in a safe way, and also to ensure that your risks are minimised where possible. And then obviously working at height regulations, these apply to church buildings just as they do to any other building, and it's important that you factor into those things where you need to work at height. And if that's maintenance of outside guttering or changing of light fittings, then obviously make sure that you're well prepared to do that and follow the right guidance. So final thoughts. Regular maintenance is, as I said before, is key to ensuring the long-term future of your church buildings. A five-year inspection survey helps you budget for repairs as they are needed. Getting appropriate advice can save wasted effort and money if it's brought in at the right time, so earlier rather than later. And a well-maintained building is more attractive to external users and can enhance the church's mission and community involvement. Lots more information can be found about buildings generally on the BUGB guideline leaflet website. So I've put up a few that might be relevant. The one about the 5-year inspection report, one about redeveloping church premises or altering church premises and on burial grounds, but there are several others on some of the topics we've already talked about. And if you have any further questions, then obviously you can email the legal and operations team at legal.ops@baptist.org.uk, where we're always happy to help and guide if we can. So that brings us to any questions.
So Steve, I have a few questions that have come through on the through the webinar. So I think this first one it's not something you haven't gone into, but it says, who is responsible for the building if there is a sole trustee in the property trust? That, and I think he's saying that trustee in this case is BUC.
Well, the general guidance that we give is that the property trustees hold the property on behalf of the church members. So the day-to-day maintenance and upkeep of the building lies with the church membership. The property trustees are there to support the church in certain projects they might be doing. So if they are requiring to buy or sell property that the trustees are holding trustees of, then they would be involved in that. But the general day-to-day maintenance of the building is for a responsibility for the church members, and through that the church leadership team.
Thank you, Steve. The next question is, there's a couple of questions on disabled access. So have you got any comments regarding issues of disability access and provision, and are there specific sources of grants for work to improve disabled access?
We have a leaflet on disability access. And one of the key things that a church can do when it's looking at its buildings is to undertake an audit, an access audit it's called, and most surveyors will be able to do that for you, identifying things where it makes it easier for disability issues to be dealt with within the church itself. So an access audit is always a good start point. The grants that you can look for disability works to buildings, we have a leaflet about grants. Generally speaking, they're not specific to that type of project, but they cover building work generally, but they will always fit in. And in the disability leaflet, there is some further links to other organisations that have guidance and help on that sort of thing as well. So I would say definitely start with the guideline leaflet as a start point.
That's leaflet L12.
Correct.
So we've got another question about fire risk assessment. Is a fire risk assessment legally required?
There is a leaflet on our website about health and safety, and that includes the fire precaution legislation that's set out. Church buildings are looked at as similar to sort of concert halls and the like. But so I suppose the answer to that is it will depend very much on the size of the building, its use, and also the external users' requirements. It's always worth having at first starting point an internal assessment of the fire precautions that you might have, and certainly check with your contractors you might have that supply fire extinguishers and the like to make sure that you comply with what they would see as a requirement for a building of the size that you've got, and the layout it has. There isn't a statutory requirement for church buildings at this point to have a full fire precaution or fire assessment from the local authority, but again, that's an option you could look to if you felt there was a need for that, especially if your building is used by a lot of people on a regular basis.
Okay, thank you. We've got one question that says the listed building committee only meet quarterly, which seems to delay approval processes. Should we not be using local council process when that's only 8 to 10 weeks? It's
the listed buildings committee meet as has been identified every 3 months, but they do engage with churches between those dates. Their committee dates are not the only times they will talk to churches or even visit churches to talk about the processes that they might be wanting to deal with. I think it's important to say that local authorities do have a statutory requirement to comply within a certain time frame, but they don't always accept an application on first drafting, because if there are things missing, then they will refuse it or turn it aside. So I think the fact that if you have a church that is listed, it does fall under the ecclesiastic exemption scheme, and you can work with the listed buildings advisory committee to try and resolve the issues you might have through a dialogue before you get to the point of actually submitting an application. Something you perhaps may not always get with a local authority, with the pressures they're under and the coverage they have within their local authority conservation officer areas.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions about church manses, which is a topic I guess we haven't gone into. Are there any particular?
We didn't touch on that. I mean, church manses generally should be the general principles of all church buildings are pretty much the same. It's important to have a survey regularly of those, but with manses, because of the fact that they are used by the church minister, then there are some obligations within that mean that you should have other checks done on them on an annual basis, such as gas safety certificates, electrical test certificates, and the like. So we haven't talked about manses particularly because they are perhaps much of a subject to be at a later date, but there are some leaflets on our website about manses generally under the PM section of our leaflet library, and if there are questions about manses that you have, then I think it's easier to just email them through so we can deal with those on a one-to-one basis.
Okay. Does the Baptist Union have a register of recommended surveyors or contractors, etc.?
We don't at this point, mainly because I suspect that the appointment of those types of people tend to be things that are personal to the church and the membership themselves. You want to employ a surveyor who understands what you might be trying to achieve, and if we had a list of national contacts, they may not all have the same coverage or even the same understanding of your locality. Generally speaking, it's much better to try and find somebody that sits right for the church than somebody from a list that we might have put together. We do have retained surveyors who we can introduce you to, and they have got almost a national coverage. But again, it's often best for you to look at who you have in your own area and look at the costs that you might incur through their processes to see if that's what best fits. So we don't provide that at this point, no.
Okay. Had somebody asking about maintenance of car parks. Sorry, lost their questions around security. Concerns that relate to security, tarmac maintenance, clearing of leaves, and getting rid of moss.
Okay.
Any particular thoughts to show?
I think security is one of the things that crops up quite regularly. It's quite easy if you've got a accessible car park for people to come and park there when they're not actually coming to church, they're going to do some shopping or something else. So you have to look at whether or not it's in the church's best interest to have some sort of control system in place, perhaps a barrier or even a lockable set of gates when they're not in use. In terms of maintenance, then clearly part of the winter or autumn programme should be to look at whether or not moss can be cleared, whether you've got enough salt to cover the car park area in terms of when it gets frosty or icy, and also in terms of tarmac, if you're having to repair tarmac, then again it's important that you get more than one quote from contractors, because it's an area that is somewhat fraught in quick fix people around that might do something very quickly but may not last for long. So I think in those sort of circumstances, you need to think long and hard about what the contractor you're employing will be able to deliver.
Okay, another question. I'm not sure I understand this one, but it says we've been told we need an access report. What does this involve?
I think that's probably to do with, I hope it's to do with disability access. And if it is, then we covered that earlier in the fact that you can have an access audit, which will allow, which will be provided by a surveyor, which will allow you to understand what you might need to do in terms of the general ingress and in your building, and how that might fit for other people with who are not as mobile as everybody else.
Okay, the final couple of questions that we have at the moment are very similar, but let me read them both out. One says, is there anyone in the BU that can give help with obtaining grants? And the second one is, what opportunities are there for external funding for repairs to a listed building identified in the 5-year survey where the extent of repairs greatly exceeds the church's budget?
Well, we have, as I've touched on already, a guideline leaflet about grants.
That's MO6.
Yes, that's right. That lists those that are around. I suppose the most obvious grant funder, perhaps the most controversial, is lottery funding. There are no current BU guidances to churches about whether or not that's acceptable or not. That's entirely for the church members to decide upon. But there are a lot of other grant funders out there who will support church work and also repairs. So if you've got things of a listed buildings nature that are beyond your repair budget, then obviously they will then look to be more helpful in those processes. We don't have anybody in-house within Baptist Union here that can give you guidance on how to make an application, but most grant funders will have people who will guide you through that process. and if you're looking at lottery funding, grant funding, then obviously they do have people that will guide you through how best to make an application. But as I say, there are lots of grant funders out there that will help support churches if that's what's required from your particular perspective.
Okay, that brings us to the end of the question. Steve, thank you for answering them all.
I think all I would say finally is if you have any particular concerns or questions about your own church building, then obviously the email at the bottom of the last but one slide is there. We're more than happy always to try and support churches and help them with their queries. And if you want to send those through to us, then we'll deal with them as soon as we can for you.